Welcome to day 8 of the query folding challenge. And with today's challenge, we are tasked with selecting the sale key, customer key, invoice date key, total excluding tax, total amount, and profit, where the invoice date key is equal to the last date of each month. So for this task, we have to use the fact sale table from the Wide World Importers database. And I think the most important factor here is the fact that the date key has to be equal to the last date of each month. So what we have to do is to figure out if the date is the last date of the month or not. If we figure that out, we can easily apply our filters and finish the challenge. So let's head over to Power BI. So as usual, the first step is to always connect to the database, right? Wide World Importers. We are using the fact sale table. Import. So right here, we know that there's a certain number of columns that we would like to select. So we go to choose columns. We're working with sale key, customer key, and let me take a look at this one more time. Sale key, customer key, invoice date key, tax excluding, total excluding tax, total amount, and profit. Total excluding tax, total amount, profit. So these are the columns that we've been tasked with selecting. Click on OK. So by default, I know selecting columns won't change anything. Query folding will still be working fine. So what we have to do now is to figure out how to identify the last day of each month. So to do that, we can just insert a custom column. So if we're inserting a custom column, there's a function that we can use. That's a date function to check to get the last date of each month. So the function is date end of month. Okay, that's end of day. What we want is end of month. Then we pass in the invoice date key date. And this gives us the end of month for each of the dates that is here, right? So if we pass in any date, we get the end of month. So this is good. What we need to do next is to compare this date to the end of month to see if it is the end of month. If that's the case, we use that to filter out the result that we need. One way we can do that is to go back to this simple function and do is equal to. So by the time we do this and click on OK, we get a true or false, right? So if we get a true, it means that's the end of month. If we get a false, it means that's not the end of month. So for our result, we can just click on OK. And now we have where this is true. And just to confirm, if you check, query folding is still happening, but the query is long. I think we have two in our queries here. So we would want to optimize this. So ideally, we can just remove this column actually. If we remove this column, we've been able to solve the problem, but we've generated a query that is very complex. So the goal here would be to optimize the query to make the query look simpler so that we won't have multiple subqueries. So one way to do that, I mentioned this earlier. If you watch any of the previous video, I mentioned that sometimes when you apply steps like filters, for example, they especially if you apply them after selecting columns, you are most likely going to get a subquery. And sometimes if you don't need, if for helper columns like the one we just added here, we may not necessarily need it. If we don't need a column, then we can take out the column or just copy the code and look for how we can use it to filter out the results that we need. So here's what we are going to do. One way to go about this is to remove this step. We already have a filter here, right? But in this instance, what we want to do is we want to filter the invoice date key. That is what we are going to do. So we have a situation here that we would want to deal with. So what we want to do is, let me copy this. Let me take this out, go a step behind, and go to invoice date key. I'm going to select a random date. Yeah. So selecting a random date has given me this step here where it's checking for invoice date key is equal to this date, but that's not what we want to use. So we're going to modify this. We're going to repeat the step we did earlier, date and of month. And you can just copy this, actually copy invoice date key and paste it here. So we are checking for where invoice date key is equal to end of month. So this should work fine. Yep. So we see that all the dates that we have here is the end of month. Then we can select the columns that we want. You see that these two steps are no longer relevant. We're going to remove these two steps. So let's look at the query that has been generated. You see that a simpler query has been generated. So we now have a query that is not too hard. We have the sales key, customer key, invoice date key, total excluding tax, total amount, profit. And just to confirm, we can look at the values, take a look at the values we have here. 31st, 28th, 30th, 31st, 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 and 30th. So we've been able to solve this problem. It's actually very simple. And what you will also focus on is always optimizing the result of the query that will be sent to the database. You don't want a very complex query being sent. Thank you for joining today. We've come to the end of today's challenge. If you've not subscribed to the channel, kindly subscribe to the channel. And if you like this video, kindly give it a like. Thank you very much and see you tomorrow.